You ever hear the sound of roots tearing before you see the damage? It's not loud at first, just a wet, fibrous snap under steel. I smelled it before I saw it, the sharp, green scent of freshly cut wood mixed with diesel exhaust hanging heavy in the morning air, and by the time I stepped out onto my porch, boots hitting the gravel, it was already too late. A backhoe sat right in the middle of my orchard, bucket half buried in the earth my father spent 30 years cultivating, its engine rumbling low like it belonged there. The operator didn't even look up. Another scoop, another section of soil peeled back, exposing roots thicker than my wrist, roots that had held this land together longer than most of the houses in that HOA had even existed. My jaw tightened as the metallic clank echoed across the trees, leaves trembling with each impact, and I could actually feel it under my feet, the vibration, like the land itself was trying to tell me something was wrong. 25 acres of orchard, planted row by row, irrigated line by line, every slope measured, every inch of drainage accounted for, and they were cutting straight through it like it was empty dirt. I didn't say a word at first. I just stood there, watching a line of bright orange survey flags slicing across my property like a scar, leading from the hill above down toward the lower basin. That's when I saw her. Margaret Holloway stepped out of a white SUV parked near my fence line, sunglasses on, clipboard in hand, walking like she owned the ground she was standing on. Her heel sank slightly into the damp soil, but she didn't seem to notice. She never did. "Mr. Caldwell," she called out, her voice smooth, rehearsed, like this was just another routine improvement. "You should have received the notice." I could taste the bitterness in the air, like metal on my tongue. "Notice for what?" I asked, already knowing the answer. She held up a sheet of paper, edges crisp, stamped with county approval. "Drainage easement. Community infrastructure upgrade. We're resolving runoff issues affecting the neighborhood downhill." I glanced past her, toward that neighborhood, rows of identical roofs, manicured lawns, not a single one of them understanding what sat above them, what controlled every drop of water that ever touched their foundations. My orchard wasn't just trees. It was a system. One my father designed with his bare hands and a level he kept in the back of his truck for 20 years. I could still hear his voice clear as day, standing beside me when I was 12, mud up to my ankles, pointing at the slope after a storm. "Water doesn't care about fences, Ethan. It remembers the land." The backhoe roared again, louder this time, and a section of irrigation pipe snapped with a hollow crack, water spilling out in a sudden rush, soaking into soil that wasn't meant to take it that way. Margaret didn't even flinch. "This will benefit everyone," she added, like that made it right. I looked at the trench they were carving, the angle, the direction, the way it cut across the natural grade, and that's when something cold settled in my chest. They didn't understand what they were doing. Not really. They saw water as a problem to push away. I saw exactly where they were sending it. I wiped my hands on my jeans slowly, eyes tracing the line from my orchard down to their subdivision, already calculating slope, volume, flow rate without even trying. They thought they were fixing a drainage issue. What they didn't know, they had just tapped into a system older than their permits, older than their HOA, older than every polished driveway down that hill. And systems like that? They don't break. They respond. I walked the trench line after they shut the machines down for the day, boots sinking slightly into the loose soil, the smell of damp earth rising with every step, thicker now that the roots were exposed and the ground had been turned over in long, uneven strips. The orchard felt wrong. Quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. Even the wind moved differently through the trees, like it was hesitating, unsure where to go without the natural channels guiding it. I crouched near one of the cut lines and ran my hand along the edge, fingers brushing against a severed root, still wet, still alive, and I could feel the tension in it, like a cable that had been snapped under load. My father used to say you could tell everything about a piece of land just by how it handled water, how it held it, how it released it, how it resisted it. He did not believe in forcing the land to behave. He believed in working with it, shaping flow the way a mechanic tunes an engine, small adjustments, precise angles, nothing wasted. I stood up and followed the trench downhill, tracking its path the way I used to as a kid after a storm, watching where the runoff gathered, where it split, where it disappeared into the ground. They had cut straight through the highest contour line, ignoring the natural grade completely, redirecting flow toward a narrow channel that fed into a buried pipe system I had not seen exposed in years. That pipe led off my property, under the fence line, and straight into the retention basin that served their entire neighborhood. I could already hear it in my head, the sound it would make when it filled too fast, that deep, hollow surge like a drum being struck from the inside. I pulled out my phone and opened the old survey maps I had scanned years ago, the ones my father kept rolled up in the back of his truck, edges worn soft from being handled so many times. The lines were still there, the elevations marked in careful handwriting, every inch of slope accounted for, every drainage point mapped with a precision that most people would never notice. I traced the route with my thumb, from the top of the orchard down to the basin, then back again, imagining the flow reversed, imagining what would happen if the gradient shifted just enough to send the water back the way it came. Not blocked. Not stopped. Just redirected. That was the difference. Most people think control means force. It does not. It means understanding. I could hear Margaret's voice in my head, talking about improvements, about fixing problems, about doing what was best for the community, and I almost laughed standing there in the fading light, because she had no idea what kind of system she had just tapped into. This was not a ditch you could dig and forget. This was not runoff you could push aside and pretend it would not come back. Water does not forget. It follows the path. That makes the most sense, the path that has been there the longest, the path that respects the land it moves through. And right now, they had just given it a new one. I stood there until the sun dipped low enough to cast long shadows between the rows of trees, the air cooling just enough to carry the faint scent of rain somewhere in the distance, and I knew exactly what I needed to do. Not tonight. Not yet. Timing mattered more than anything. Flow rate, soil saturation, rainfall volume, all of it had to line up. I was not going to fight them in court. I was not going to argue permits or easements or signatures on paper. I was going to let the system they believed they controlled show them exactly how wrong they were. And all it was going to take was a small adjustment in direction. By the next morning, the machines were back before the sun fully cleared the ridge, their engines coughing to life in the cool air, the low hum rolling across the orchard like a warning I could not ignore. I stood by the fence this time, arms crossed, watching as they picked up exactly where they left off, digging deeper, widening the trench, turning what used to be a carefully balanced drainage system into something crude and aggressive. Dirt piled up in uneven mounds, clumps of grass and broken roots scattered like debris from a storm that had not yet come. One of the workers adjusted a pipe section near the lower end, lining it up with the outflow that fed into the HOA basin, and I noticed how slightly off the angle was, just a few degrees too steep, enough to accelerate flow when it rained but not enough for anyone without experience to question it. That was the problem with people who only saw blueprints. They trusted paper more than land. Margaret arrived again mid-morning, same SUV, same clipboard, same steady confidence like this was all under control, and this time she walked closer to me, stopping just short of the fence line as if crossing it might actually mean something. Progress is looking good, she said, glancing over her shoulder at the trench like she was admiring a finished project instead of a disruption. I did not respond right away. I let the silence stretch. Just long enough for her smile to tighten at the edges. You ever worked with water systems before? I asked finally, keeping my voice level. She gave a short, dismissive laugh. We have engineers for that. I nodded slowly, eyes drifting back to the trench, following the line down the slope again, mentally mapping every inch of what they had changed. Yeah, I said quietly. I figured. She shifted her weight slightly, tapping her pen against the clipboard, already losing interest in the conversation. To her, this was done. Approved, signed, executed. Just another improvement checked off a list. She turned and walked back toward her vehicle without another word, heels pressing shallow impressions into the loosened soil that would not hold shape for long. I stayed there long after she left, watching the workers finish their adjustments, watching how the soil settled, how the loose dirt collapsed inward just slightly along the edges, how the exposed pipe reflected sunlight in sharp, clean lines that did not belong in a system built to blend into the land. By late afternoon, they packed up, engines fading into the distance, leaving behind a trench that cut through my orchard like it had always been there, like the land had agreed to it. But I knew better. I walked it again, slower this time, stopping at key points, crouching down, running my hands along the grade, feeling the subtle shifts in elevation they had created without realizing it. Near the upper section, just below the highest row of trees, I found what I was looking for. The old control junction. Buried under a layer of compacted soil and grass, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. My father had installed it decades ago, a simple gate system that could redirect excess runoff during heavy storms, not to fight the water but to guide it, to spread it evenly so no single area took the full force. It had not been used in years because it never needed to be. Until now. I cleared the surface carefully, brushing away dirt until the metal edge was exposed, dull and weathered but still intact, still functional. I pressed down slightly and felt the resistance, the internal mechanism shifting. Just enough to confirm it was not locked, not seized, just waiting. I sat back on my heels, looking from the junction down to the trench, then beyond that to the neighborhood sitting comfortably below, rows of rooftops catching the late sun, completely unaware of how connected they were to the land they thought they had controlled. The air felt heavier now, the faint scent of moisture stronger, like the atmosphere itself was preparing for something. I stood up slowly, wiping my hands on my jeans, and took one last look at the line they had carved through my orchard. They had not just changed the path of water. They had changed the balance. And balance, once shifted, does not correct itself quietly. It responds in full. I did not need to rush. I did not need to argue. All I needed to do was wait for the right conditions and make a single adjustment at the right moment. Because once the water started moving the way it was supposed to, there would be no stopping it. And for the first time since those machines showed up, I felt completely in control again. I woke up to the smell before I heard the forecast, that thick metallic scent in the air that comes right before a real storm, not a passing drizzle but the kind that settles in and soaks everything it touches, and by the time I stepped outside with my coffee, the sky had already turned that deep, heavy grey that presses down on the land like a weight. The orchard was still, almost too still, leaves barely moving, the ground holding its breath, and I could feel the moisture building under my boots even before the first drop fell. I checked the weather on my phone out of habit, not because I needed confirmation, but because I wanted the numbers, the timing, the volume. 2 to 3 inches overnight. Maybe more if the front stalled. I exhaled slowly, tasting the humidity, and glanced down the slope toward the trench they had carved, now dry and waiting, a clean line cutting through soil that was never meant to channel that much water that fast. By mid-morning, the first drops started, soft at first, tapping against leaves, darkening the dirt in scattered patches, but it did not stay gentle for long. Within an hour, the sound changed. It always does. From scattered taps to a steady hiss, then to a constant drumming that filled the entire orchard, rain hitting leaves, branches, ground, metal, everything at once. Water began to collect along the trench almost immediately, shallow at first, then rising, finding the path they had forced into the land, accelerating as it moved downhill. I walked the upper rows slowly, hood pulled up, watching how the flow formed, how it gathered, how it responded to the new grade. It was faster than it should have been. More aggressive. The kind of flow that does not spread out, does not soak in, just moves. That was their mistake. By early afternoon, the trench was running full, a narrow stream pushing hard against the sides, carrying loose soil with it, carving deeper without needing help. I could hear the low rush now, even over the rain, a steady, growing sound that echoed off the trees. I made my way to the old control junction, boots sinking into the softened ground, mud clinging with each step, and crouched down beside it, wiping away the layer of water that had already started to pool around the metal edge. My fingers wrapped around the handle, cold and slick, and I paused for just a second, feeling the pressure building in the system around me. This was not about forcing anything. This was about timing. About letting the volume reach the point where a small change would matter. I stood back up and waited, rain running down the back of my neck, soaking through my jacket, the air thick and heavy with the smell of wet soil and crushed leaves. Minutes stretched. The flow increased. The trench began to strain at the edges, water pushing faster, louder now, the sound deeper, more urgent. I looked downhill again, toward the neighborhood, barely visible through the rain, roofs blurred, streets hidden under the haze. They were probably inside, watching the storm from behind glass, trusting the system they had just installed to handle it. Trusting the trench. Trusting the pipes. Trusting the idea that they had fixed something they never fully understood. I knelt down again, this time without hesitation, and pressed the control gate slowly. Feeling it shift under my hand, just a few inches at first, then a little more, enough to change the angle of the upper flow, enough to give the water another option, another path that followed the original grade my father had designed decades ago. The response was immediate but subtle. The stream did not stop. It did not reverse all at once. It adjusted. A portion of the flow began to split, feeding into the old channel, increasing pressure on the system below in a way that was not obvious from the surface. I stood there, watching the water redistribute, listening as the sound changed slightly, deeper now, more complex, like something waking up. I did not need to do anything else. I stepped back from the junction, wiped the mud from my hands, and walked uphill, leaving the system to do exactly what it had always been designed to do. Because once the water found that path again, it would follow it all the way down. And this time, it would not be the orchard taking the hit. The rain did not let up that night. It settled in like it had nowhere else to be, steady and relentless, the kind that does not crash down in bursts but builds, layer by layer, soaking deeper with every hour until the ground has no choice but to give. I stood on the porch for a long time, watching the orchard disappear into a blur of grey and dark green, the rows of trees fading into silhouettes as water moved through them in ways I had not seen in years. The sound had changed again. It was no longer just rain on leaves or the soft rush along the trench. It had become something fuller, heavier, a continuous low roar that came from below the surface as much as above it. I could feel it through the wood under my boots, a faint vibration traveling up from the saturated soil, the entire system working at once. By midnight, the upper ground was fully saturated, every inch holding as much as it could, and the excess had nowhere to go but down. That was when the shift really happened. The redirected flow began to dominate, pulling more water into the original channels, feeding them faster than they had been designed to handle under normal conditions, but still within the limits my father had planned for when the land saw extreme storms. The difference now was not the volume alone. It was the added pressure from the trench, forcing water into the system at a rate the HOA drainage could not balance out. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped back outside, rain hitting my jacket in a steady, heavy rhythm, the beam cutting through the darkness just enough to show the ground in front of me. The path down to the junction was slick, mud clinging to every step, but I knew it well enough to move without hesitation. When I reached it, the water was already pushing hard through both channels, the split now fully active, the old route carrying more than it had in decades. The sound coming from the lower pipe was deeper now, a hollow surge that echoed faintly up the line, exactly the way I remembered from storms when I was a kid, only stronger this time. I angled the flashlight down the slope, watching the flow accelerate as it disappeared into the section that led off my property. Somewhere beyond that, under streets and lawns and perfectly leveled yards, that water was entering a system that had never been designed to receive it like this. Not all at once. Not from this direction. I stood there for a moment, letting the rain run down my face, blinking it out of my eyes as I listened. No alarms. No shouting. Just the storm doing what storms do. I turned and walked back uphill, leaving the junction exactly where it needed to be, untouched now, because there was nothing left to adjust. The system had taken over completely. Back inside, I left the lights off and sat near the window, watching the faint outline of the orchard through the glass, the occasional flicker of distant lightning illuminating the slope in brief, sharp flashes. Each time it lit up, I could see the water lines more clearly, thin streams turning into broader flows, converging, moving with purpose. Hours passed like that, the sound never stopping, never slowing, just building into a steady, controlled force that did not need my help anymore. Sometime just before dawn, the rain finally began to ease, the intensity dropping from a constant roar to a softer, lingering patter, but by then it did not matter. The ground was already beyond full, every channel engaged, every slope feeding downward. I stepped back onto the porch as the sky lightened just enough to reveal the shape of the land again, and for a moment, everything looked calm. The orchard stood where it always had, quiet, still, water settling into the places it belonged. But when I looked past it, down toward the neighborhood, I could see it. Not clearly at first. Just a change in color. A darker tone where there should have been clean lines and bright surfaces. Then as the light grew, the details sharpened. Water where it should not be. Spreading wider. Sitting higher than their system could move it. I exhaled slowly, the cool morning air cutting through the lingering dampness, and rested my hands on the railing. I had not forced anything. I had not broken anything. I had simply allowed the land to return to balance. And sometimes, balance does not look the way people expect it to. By the time the sun fully broke through the clouds, the neighborhood below did not look like the same place Margaret had been so proud of just a day earlier. The clean lines were gone. Lawns that had been trimmed to perfection now sat under a thin, uneven layer of standing water, reflecting the pale morning light in dull, broken patches. Driveways held shallow pools that crept slowly toward garage doors, and the retention basin at the center of it all, the one their entire system depended on, was no longer a basin. It was full. Completely full. I leaned slightly over the porch railing, narrowing my eyes as I studied the way the water moved, not rushing anymore, just sitting, spreading, looking for space that did not exist. That was the part most people never understood. Flooding is not always violent. Sometimes it is quiet. Methodical. It just stays until there is nowhere else for it to go. A faint hum carried up the hill, not from the storm this time but from activity below. Doors opening. Engine starting. Distant voices cutting through the damp air, sharp and confused. I could see small movements now, figures stepping out onto sidewalks, stopping, looking down, then around, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. It always starts that way. First confusion, then concern. I grabbed my jacket and walked down the slope just far enough to get a clearer view without crossing onto their side, boots pressing into soft ground that had already begun to stabilize on my property, the system here doing exactly what it was meant to do, distributing, absorbing, balancing. Below me, that same balance did not exist. I watched as a maintenance truck pulled up near the basin, two workers stepping out, one pointing toward the overflow pipe, the other shaking his head before walking closer, crouching down to inspect something I already knew they would not like. The pipe was working. That was the problem. It was not blocked. It was overwhelmed. There is a difference, and it matters. A blocked system can be cleared. An overloaded one has to wait. I spotted Margaret a few minutes later, her white SUV moving slower than usual through the street, tires pushing small waves of water outward as she drove. She stopped near the basin and stepped out quickly, her posture already tense, scanning the area, taking in the situation piece by piece. Even from where I stood, I could tell she was trying to hold on to control, trying to find a simple explanation, something she could point to and fix. Her heels touched the wet pavement and she hesitated for half a second, just enough to register that things were not going according to plan. One of the workers approached her, gesturing toward the basin, then up the line, likely explaining the inflow, the volume, the rate they were dealing with. She turned slightly, following his gesture, and for the first time since this started, her gaze moved uphill. Not directly at me, not yet, but in this direction. Toward the source. Toward the land they had cut into without understanding it. I stayed still, hands in my pockets, letting the distance do its work, letting her look without giving her anything more than what she could already see. Because from her perspective, nothing here looked altered. The orchard stood intact. The trench was exactly where they had left it. There were no signs of interference, no obvious changes, nothing she could point to and say, "This is what went wrong." And that was the truth. Nothing had gone wrong. Everything was working exactly as the system dictated. The only difference was that the system now included the original flow they had ignored. A gust of wind carried the scent of wet asphalt and standing water up the hill, mixing with the fading smell of rain, and I took a slow breath, watching as more residents stepped outside, some lifting pant legs, others simply standing there, arms crossed, staring at the water creeping further into spaces it had never reached before. No one was panicking. Not yet. But the realization was setting in. This was not going away quickly. This was not something a pump or a quick fix could handle in an afternoon. This was going to take time. I turned slightly, glancing back at the orchard behind me, row steady, ground stable, everything in balance again, then looked back down at the neighborhood one more time. I did not need to say anything. I did not need to explain. The land was doing that for me. And for the first time, they were finally listening. Margaret did not wait long. By late morning, her SUV was already climbing the gravel path toward my property, tires crunching louder than usual against the damp surface, the sound carrying ahead of her like a warning. I stayed where I was, near the edge of the orchard, watching her approach without moving to meet her. The air had shifted again, the storm gone but the ground still heavy with moisture, every step leaving a faint imprint that took its time settling back. She stepped out before the engine fully cut off, door closing sharper than necessary, her usual composed posture replaced by something tighter, more controlled, like she was holding back the urge to rush. "We need to talk," she said, walking straight toward me, heels sinking slightly into the softened dirt, each step less confident than the last. I did not answer immediately. I let her close the distance, let her stand there with the orchard stretching behind me and the slope falling away behind her, the entire system laid out between us without a single word needing to explain it. "You changed something," she added, her voice lower now, more focused, like she was testing the idea out loud before committing to it. I glanced past her for a moment, down toward the neighborhood, where the water still sat, not rising anymore but not going anywhere either, held in place by a system that had reached its limit. "Did I?" I said finally, keeping my tone even. Her jaw tightened slightly. "Our drainage system was functioning as designed," she replied, the words sounding rehearsed, pulled straight from the same place as her permits and notices. "This level of overflow does not happen without interference." I nodded once, slow, almost thoughtful. "You are right," I said. "It does not." The silence that followed stretched longer this time, heavier, filled only by the faint drip of water from the trees and the distant murmur of activity below. She shifted her weight, glancing briefly at the trench behind me, then back at my face, trying to connect pieces that did not quite fit together. "Then explain it," she said, the edge in her voice sharper now, less controlled. I took a step to the side, just enough to give her a clearer view of the slope, the trench, the orchard, all of it laid out exactly as it had been since her crew finished their work. "Your trench is intact," I said. "Your pipes are clear. Your basin is working." I paused just long enough for the words to settle before adding, "It is just not enough." Her expression shifted, not to understanding yet, but to resistance, like she was hearing something she did not want to accept. "We followed the approved plans," she insisted. "We addressed the runoff issues." I let out a quiet breath, the cool air carrying the lingering scent of wet soil between us. "You addressed the symptoms," I said. "Not the system." She frowned slightly, the first real crack in her composure. "Water does not just come from one place," I continued, gesturing lightly toward the orchard. "It moves across everything. Elevation, saturation, pressure. You cut into that without accounting for the original flow, and now it is doing exactly what it is supposed to do. It is finding the path that makes sense." Her eyes followed my gesture this time, tracing the line of the trench, then the slope. Beyond it, then down toward the neighborhood again. I could see it starting to connect, not fully, not comfortably, but enough to create doubt. "So you are saying this is our fault," she said, quieter now, less certain. I met her gaze without hesitation. "I am saying," I replied, "that nothing here is broken." The words hung there, simple and final, and for a moment she did not respond. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves, carrying the faint sound of water shifting somewhere below, still moving, still working through a system that had finally been forced to reveal itself. She looked at me again, longer this time, searching for something she could push against, something she could challenge, but there was nothing to point to, nothing to fix, nothing to undo with a signature or a phone call. Because this was not paperwork. This was physics. And physics does not negotiate. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping just a fraction, and turned her gaze back toward the flooded streets below. I followed it for a second, then back to the orchard, steady and quiet behind me. I had not raised my voice. I had not made a threat. I had not needed to. The land had already done that for me. Margaret stayed quiet longer than I expected, her eyes still fixed on the neighborhood below like she was trying to will the water to move faster, to disappear, to prove that this was temporary, manageable, something she could still control. But the longer she stood there, the clearer it became that this was not a surface problem. This was structural. I watched her shift her stance again, less rigid now, more grounded, like she was finally starting to feel the weight of what she was dealing with. "What does it take to fix it?" she asked, and this time there was no edge in her voice, no authority layered into the question, just a straightforward ask. I let the silence sit for a second before answering, not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted her to understand that this was not a quick solution. "Time," I said first, letting the word land on its own. "And correction." She turned her head slightly toward me, waiting. I gestured toward the trench behind me. "That." Cut redirected flow too aggressively. It pushed more volume downhill than your basin can release. You created a bottleneck without realizing it. I stepped a few feet closer to the edge of the slope, pointing along the natural grade lines that were now faintly visible where the soil had shifted. The land already had a system. It spread water out. Slowed it down. Balanced it across the slope. You bypassed that. She followed my line of sight, her gaze tracing the subtle curves in the terrain, the way the orchard rose aligned with the slope instead of cutting against it. "So what are you saying?" she asked. "We need to remove it." I shook my head once. "Not remove. Adjust. You need to reduce the direct flow into your pipe system. Let the water disperse again before it reaches your basin." She looked back at the trench, then down at the flooded streets, then back at me, the calculation visible in her expression now, the shift from denial to problem solving. "That is not what the engineers recommended," she said, quieter this time. I almost smiled at that. "Then your engineers are looking at diagrams," I replied. "Not the land." Another pause settled between us, but this one felt different, less confrontational, more like a transition. The sound of distant pumps starting up carried faintly through the air, a low mechanical hum trying to fight against a problem that was already too large for quick fixes. Margaret took a slow breath, then nodded once, almost to herself. "We will need access," she said, glancing back toward the trench line that crossed my property. I met her gaze without hesitation. "You already took it," I said, my tone calm but steady. She held my eyes for a moment, then looked away, that same realization settling in again, heavier this time. The orchard stood quiet behind me, leaves still damp, branches steady, the ground holding firm now that the system had rebalanced itself. Down below, the water remained, not rising anymore, but not leaving either, held in place by a design that had never accounted for the full picture. Margaret shifted her weight again, then turned slightly toward her vehicle, but she did not leave immediately. She looked back. Once more at the slope, at the trench, at the orchard, like she was seeing it for the first time without the filter of control or assumption. "We will fix it," she said finally, more to herself than to me. I nodded once, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement. Because fixing it was never about force. It was about understanding. And now, finally, she was starting to see what that meant. I turned slightly, glancing back over the orchard rows, then down toward the neighborhood one more time, the quiet spread of water reflecting a sky that was finally beginning to clear. The storm had passed. The system had spoken. And what came next would depend entirely on whether they chose to listen or not. The water did not disappear overnight. It receded slowly, inch by inch, like the land was taking its time reclaiming control, pulling everything back into balance at its own pace instead of rushing to meet anyone's expectations. By the second day, the standing pools had thinned into long reflective strips along the streets, the kind that still forced people to step carefully, lifting their shoes, watching where they placed their weight. By the third, the basin had finally dropped below its edge again, the pressure easing just enough for the system to start breathing instead of holding. I watched it all from the same spot on the slope, hands resting loosely at my sides, the orchard behind me steady and unchanged, like it had already moved on. The crews came back early that morning, not with the same confidence they had before, but with a different kind of focus. Quieter. More deliberate. No loud assumptions, no rushed movements. They walked the trench line first, measuring, checking grade, talking in low voices as they compared what they were seeing to whatever plans they had brought with them. This time, they did not start digging right away. They observed. Margaret arrived a little later, but she did not step out of the vehicle immediately. She sat there for a moment, looking across the land, taking in the full picture without the urgency that had driven her before. When she finally stepped out, she left the clipboard behind. That alone told me everything I needed to know. She walked up the slope again, slower this time, her steps more careful, not because the ground was soft, but because she was paying attention now. When she reached me, she did not lead with instructions or explanations. She simply nodded once. "We are going to adjust the flow," she said, her voice steady, but different. Not softer. Just grounded. I returned the nod, then glanced toward the trench where the crew had already begun marking new lines, smaller cuts, angled differently, designed to spread the water instead of forcing it. "You will need to break that direct channel," I said. "Let the upper ground absorb more before it reaches your system." She followed my gaze, then looked back at me. "We will," she replied, without hesitation. No argument. No pushback. Just acceptance of what needed to be done. I stepped aside as the crew moved into position, tools replacing machines in the first phase, hands working the soil instead of tearing through it, reshaping rather than carving. The sound was different this time. No harsh metal scraping, no heavy engine noise. Just the steady rhythm of work that matched the land instead of fighting it. Over the next few hours, I watched the system begin to shift again, small changes in slope, slight diversions that would not mean much to someone looking at it casually, but would change everything once the next storm came. Margaret stayed for most of it, not directing, not interrupting, just observing, occasionally asking a question, but mostly listening. That was the real change. By the end of the day, the trench no longer looked like a cut. It looked like part of the land again. Not perfect. Not original. But closer to balance than it had been. I took a slow breath, the air now carrying the clean scent of drying soil instead of standing water, and looked out over both properties, the orchard and the neighborhood below, connected whether anyone liked it or not. Margaret stepped back toward her vehicle, pausing for a moment before getting in. "We will review everything before the next rain," she said, almost like a promise. I gave a small nod in return, then turned slightly, letting my eyes follow the natural lines of the land. One more time. I did not need to check anything. I could already feel it settling. Balance returning. As her vehicle pulled away, the gravel crunching softly under the tires, the orchard stood quiet again, the way it always had when things were right. I rested my hands in my pockets and looked out over the slope, the faint trace of water lines already fading back into the soil, leaving no sign of what had happened beyond what the land itself remembered. Because in the end, I did not fight them. I did not stop them. I just let the system they ignored show them exactly how it works. And water, unlike people, never needs to argue. It just finds the truth and follows it all the way down.